Welcome to another one of my cheesy YouTube videos. Today is part 2 of my 1968 Dodge D100 rebuild video. And today we're going to start reassembling the transmission. Hey, one thing you may want to consider doing is taking a tap. In this case it's a bottom tap because it's not pointed on the end. So it's made to reach deeper into the hole. The starter tap will be pointed. But you take your tap, of the correct size of course, and just run your tap through the existing holes to clean them. You're not looking to cut threads, you're going to be real gentle that you don't get it sideways and start cutting new threads. Just kind of scrape any crud that might be in there out. This is not as crucial for this, but it'd be relatively crucial for like head bolts, something that you're going to torque, because this is taking some effort to turn it. And if I was torquing, this effort is going to register on the torque wrench. So if it's, let's say this is taking 5 foot-pounds to turn, and I'm supposed to torque these holes to 25 foot-pounds. Well, when it hits 25, I've actually just torqued it to 20, because 5 of the foot-pounds is just turning the bolt through the crappy hole. These holes are blind because they're not drilled all the way through, so the tap is going to bottom out. So I'll just run the tap through all the holes. That way when I put my bolts in, it'll be nice and clean. And after I run the tap like I just did, you'll see it coming out pretty cruddy looking. I'll flush the tap in the hole with some brake cleaner. To clean the transmission case up, I dunked it in a mixture of muriatic acid and water. Read the instructions, be careful. Muriatic acid, it can be really cruel and probably not too good for your lungs if you'd inhale it. So, know what you're doing before you use it. But it did a fair job cleaning the case up. Usually I'd leave it in longer and it'll clean it up real good. And that's also how I clean fuel tanks out. I'm putting the bearings back in the counter shaft. I took the bearings and I wiped them, washed them and wiped them. And then still making sure there's no debris on them as I deal with them. And this is where I like to have my fingers clean and no gloves, so I can feel grit on there. What I did, I've already got 2 sets of bearings inside the shaft. Right here's the sleeve, that piece of pipe or that sleeve that slides on the shaft. It's just sitting at this end, but I can push it in if I want to. I'm taking grease. They make grease specially for this. I don't have any, but put some grease on the shaft and set my bearings in there. And I didn't know, as you remember when we took it apart, everything kind of just fell out. So it turns out that there's 2 sets of roller bearings on each end of the shaft. And I should have the right amount. That's one reason why I'm doing this right now. Even if this all comes apart later on, I'm okay with that. I just want to make sure I've got all the roller bearings, because as I kept cleaning that transmission, it was kind of really filthy inside. I kept running across roller bearings and got me nervous that maybe some of them got away from me. So by putting them on the shaft, I can tell if I got everything. Get this shaft together, I'm going to wrap it up in plastic or something and stick it somewhere out of the way. I put another spacer. I'll put another spacer in. I can actually shove these bearings up into the assembly. Once they're shoved up in there, they're kind of safe. Safe from falling apart, but I'm going to pull this shaft out in order to install it. And they'll probably stay together, being that the grease is so sticky. And I'll be careful pulling them apart, that's for sure. but I just wanted to get this counter shaft together before I start cleaning up the transmission case. All right, so I got my brass washers and they're holding everything together on the inside. Then on this back side, we have this machine plate, which will sit right here. Actually, I'll look at it. I'll find this mark here that shows that where it hasn't been rubbed, and there's a cut in housing for that. Put that on facing backwards. So everything's back together the way it came apart, which is wonderful. All right, it's time to assemble the counter shaft. This gear goes in the front of the case. This side goes in the rear of the case. There are two ways I could be doing this. First is I'm pulling this shaft out, leaving the bearings inside the gears. Now I run the risk of them bearings falling out of place. So just rollers stacked, they were stacked around this shaft. And hopefully there's enough grease on them bearings to hold them in place. There's another brass washer. Two more dimples. They're not the same size as the dimples on this other one. I'm setting this one. There's some cutouts inside the housing. And it's just sitting inside the housing. So we got a brass washer here. On the back side, this machine washer is also going to go on the shaft between the brass washer and the transmission housing. I'm going to continue to pull this shaft out with my fingers crossed at this point. Let me grease this. There's also a mark on this machine piece, and there's some, I'm assuming it was one of the reliefs in there that created that mark, so let me line that up also. This piece very well may be a slinger. Continue to pull my shaft out. Cross my fingers that everything stays in place. And just holding onto this brass washer helped kept the bearings from pulling out. There's a machined cutout on the shaft, and that's where the keyway goes. It's only on one side, the back side. Start it in, line it up with that machined part. Now I got to drop my gears inside of this cage. What I should have done is cut a wooden dowel about the same diameter of the pin and only as long as the gear assembly. Then I could have slid the wooden dowel in there holding the bearings in place. You'll see the bearings. And then as I put the pin in, I would have pushed. Let's see what happens. Lining the gears up with my finger. All right, it's going. Gotta line my keyway up. This notch needs to line up with the cutout in the bore. That bore is not completely round, there's a cutout. Here's the key. grease that key up. Keep wiping my fingers off. That's why I don't wear gloves. I can feel that grit, I can wipe them off. I can know I'm keeping it as clean as I possibly can. I don't know that I can do that with gloves on. Just grease the crud out of that key. See it moving? Taking a little effort, but it's moving. Should be fine. Using a brass drift would have been the best idea, but I don't think I'm hitting the pin hard enough to flare it. You also want to wear eye protection because the hard-headed hammer and the hard pin, something could chip. When the tail shaft housing bolts on, it's going to hold this pin in and the reverse pin in. Now the shaft's in place. Everything spins freely. Very easy and freely. I think if there's a teeny bit of back and forth play, that would be expected. And that's perfect. That feels great. If there's a lot, that would tell me a washer fell out. If there was none, that would tell me it's in a bind. So I feel good. I feel real good. That means our bearing stayed in place. No evidence of anything have fallen loose in there. Okay, let's figure out how this all goes back together. This is the tail shaft and main shaft together as one assembly. This bearing rides in a machine bore in the back of the transmission housing. These splines are what forward and reverse gears ride on. The shift fork would sit in here. Next thing that goes on will be the second and third gear. It's got a machined bore and the shaft has got a machined surface. Fits real nicely. On one side of the gear, there are this little tin plate, it's a spring. And this spring pushes the synchronizer back out. These small splines are for the synchronizer and the synchronizer plate. It has also got internal splines, which goes on splines on the shaft. Next thing to probably go on would be the synchronizer. It's got internal splines to it also. Cone facing forward. And this is the forward end. This is the tail shaft in that direction. Forward end, tail shaft. Work it onto them splines on them little gears. There it goes. I don't know if you can see it, but that spring pushes that synchronizer away from the gear. Next thing to go on is this, next thing to go on will be this plate here. It's just going to kind of, and that's what the synchronizer goes into. Then this shaft goes on, clock to the right position. And there's another one of these, it clocks on opposite of the first one. Then its synchronizer goes in behind there. This is the input shaft. It's got the bearing that goes on the front of the housing. It's got a gear that it's machined as part of the input shaft, and it mates with the counter shaft gear. This gear spins the counter shaft. This is the same spline here for the synchronizers. It's got a bearing in there that rides on the bearing surface of the input shaft. And this is how it all sits together. And the shift fork will go on here and move this back and forth. The clutch fork rides on this piece here, and the detent is predetermines where this is going to sit when it's in gear or when it's in neutral, when it's in the other gear. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and start reassembling this. First thing I want to do is slide my first and reverse gear in place, putting it into the fork. Next, I'm going to start my tail shaft in and into my first and reverse. Probably about the same time I need to be starting it into my other gear. Put this synchronizer in. This is part of the synchronizer assembly. It's got to go in. It's going to let the synchronizer ride in it. Well, not yet. You put this gear cluster in. Next, I need to install this plate, also part of the synchronizer. Get to line up with the forks just right. It's in the fork. Okay, the snap ring holds them smaller gears on the shaft, and I believe they're actually where they need to be. Again, this. So hold your tongue just right, get this bad boy together. The fact the shaft is not driven in all the way is causing this back, the collar like this, but the back one is probably bumping against that gear down there. So I should drive this shaft the rest of the way in. My safety glasses on. I am driving the outside race into its bore. If I was driving this bearing on the shaft, I would be hitting on the inside race. Never drive a bearing on the opposite race. Whatever race has got the press fit is the race I'm hitting on. That way I'm not compromising integrity of the bearing. I'm going to start the input shaft with its synchronizer brass wear ring on there. Input shaft should come in from this end. Same thing. Usually a bearing going in a bore like this, you can tap it, and once it gets squared, the bore and the machine fit won't let it cock in anymore. All right, the input shaft's in. The output shaft is almost in. I'm still lacking a little bit. The bearing's got to go up inside the back bore in order for the snap ring to go on. I'll use a blunt chisel. In this case, this chisel is actually broken off, to tap the race all the way in. I'll set down the race and just give it some blows. Brass punches work there too. Like I said, no gloves. Feeling for dirt. See that snap ring pop in place? Looks good. Sounds good. I believe we got it assembled. I'll look real careful on the table as I start cleaning up and make sure I'm not missing any parts. I'll put the seals in, change out the shifter seals, all my plugs, put them in, and consider it done. I don't like to go crazy with the Permatex when I put my tail shaft housing, my input shaft housing, or any of my gaskets. And I probably won't use any gasket sealer at all on them, because it's the gasket itself that's creating the seal. The only reason why I would use a Permatex, RTV, gasket sealer, whatever, to hold the gasket in place so I can put the other half on. And I don't think I'm going to need to do that. I'll go ahead and put the covers back on and put the seals in. And remember, if you love life and learning new things, go aimless.com.